I knew my career was over the moment my boss slid a white envelope across the conference table. What I didn't know was that 48 hours later, the same man would call me from his private office, his voice shaking, and say 4 words I never expected to hear. I need you back. But before that happened, I had to walk out of the company with everyone watching. My name is Emily Carter, and for 7 years, I had worked at Westbridge Solutions, a growing business consulting firm in Chicago. I started as a junior financial analyst and eventually became the director of operations. I wasn't the loudest person in the company. I wasn't the one who stayed late just so people could see me. I simply knew how the business worked. I knew which clients were profitable, which contracts were dangerous, where money was being wasted, and which systems kept the entire company moving. And unfortunately, I had recently discovered something my boss didn't want me to find. His name was Richard Coleman. Richard was the kind of executive who could walk into a room and make everyone straighten their backs. He wore expensive suits, spoke calmly, and rarely raised his voice. But he had one weakness. He hated being questioned. 3 weeks before I was fired, I noticed something strange in our quarterly financial reports. A major client had been charged nearly $480,000 for consulting services that our records showed we had never actually delivered. At first, I assumed it was an accounting mistake. So I checked again. Then I checked the invoices. Then the approval records. The same name kept appearing. David Mercer. David was Richard's longtime business partner and the company's chief financial officer. I printed the records and took them to Richard. He didn't even look surprised. He simply closed the office door. Emily, he said, you've been here long enough to know that not everything in a company is your business. I stared at him. I found nearly $500,000 in unexplained invoices. I said, I'll handle it. Richard, if the client discovers this, they won't. His tone changed. Not angry. Worse. Threateningly calm. I left his office that afternoon with a feeling I couldn't shake. 2 days later, I received an email from Human Resources. Mandatory executive meeting. 9 a.m. When I entered the conference room, Richard was sitting at the head of the table. David was beside him. Our HR director, Karen Mitchell, sat across from them with a folder in front of her. And there was one more thing that made my stomach tighten. 3 department managers were already sitting against the wall. They had been invited to watch. Richard gestured toward the empty chair. Sit down, Emily. I did. He opened the folder. After reviewing your recent performance, we've decided to terminate your employment effective immediately. For a second, I honestly thought I had misheard him. My performance? Richard nodded. You've become increasingly difficult to manage. David looked down at the table, pretending to be uncomfortable. I looked at Karen. She wouldn't meet my eyes. I slowly turned back toward Richard. Can you tell me what I actually did? Richard sighed. You made several unauthorized changes to financial procedures. That isn't true. You also accessed confidential company information without permission. I was doing my job. You were exceeding your authority. My heart started pounding. Then Richard said the sentence that hurt more than the termination itself. Your judgment has become a liability. I looked around the room. 7 years. 7 years of weekends. 7 years of missed vacations. 7 years of answering emergency calls at midnight. And this was how it ended. Not privately. Not respectfully. In front of the people I had trained. I stood up. If you want me gone, fine. But don't lie about why. Richard's expression hardened. Security will escort you downstairs. That was when something inside me changed. I didn't beg. I didn't cry. I didn't threaten him. I simply picked up my purse. As I walked toward the door, one of the managers, Tom Reynolds, quietly said my name. Emily. I stopped. He looked terrified. I could tell he wanted to say something, but Richard was staring directly at him. So Tom lowered his eyes. I walked out. The elevator doors closed behind me, and only then did I allow myself to breathe. Outside, Chicago was cold and gray. I sat on a bench near the building entrance, holding the small cardboard box security had given me. My entire career had been reduced to a box. A coffee mug, a framed photograph, a notebook, and a spare phone charger. I stared at the company logo above the entrance. I should have felt defeated. Instead, I felt suspicious. Because Richard had made one mistake. He had accused me of accessing confidential information. But he never told me which information. And I knew exactly why. That afternoon, I went home and opened my personal laptop. I had never copied company files. But months earlier, during a major audit, I had legally retained emails and documents that had been sent directly to my personal account because our internal server had been experiencing problems. Most of them were harmless. Until I found one email. It was from David Mercer. The subject line read, Transfer completed. Need Richard's confirmation. My hands went cold. I opened it. The email referenced the same client. The same $480,000. And then I saw something that made my stomach drop. The money hadn't disappeared because of an accounting mistake. It had been transferred to a consulting company I had never heard of. I searched the company's registration details. My breathing stopped. The company wasn't owned by some random contractor. It was registered to a man named Michael Coleman, Richard's younger brother. I leaned back in my chair. So that was it. The money wasn't missing. It had been moved. And Richard hadn't fired me because of my performance. He had fired me because I had gotten too close. I stared at the email for several minutes. Then my phone rang. The number was blocked. I almost ignored it, but something told me to answer. Hello. There was silence. Then a man's voice whispered, Emily, if you still have those documents, don't trust anyone at Westbridge. My entire body went still. Who is this? The caller didn't answer. Instead, he said something that made my blood run cold. Richard didn't fire you because you found the money. A pause. He fired you because you found out where the money was going next. The call ended. I stared at the phone. Then I looked back at the email on my screen. And for the first time since I walked out of Westbridge, I realized something terrifying. Getting fired wasn't the end of my career. It was the beginning of something much bigger. For the next hour, I didn't move. The phone call kept replaying in my head. Richard didn't fire you because you found the money. He fired you because you found out where the money was going next. I wanted to believe there had to be another explanation. Maybe someone was trying to frighten me. Maybe the caller was lying. But then I opened the email again. The transfer had been approved by David Mercer, and the receiving company was registered to Richard's brother. That wasn't a coincidence. I made myself a cup of coffee and opened a blank notebook. At the top of the first page, I wrote 3 words. Don't trust anyone. Then I started building a timeline. The first suspicious invoice appeared 6 months earlier. The transfers became larger every month. And every time money moved, David had approved it. But there was something else. A pattern. The fake consulting payments always happened shortly before major client payments arrived. Someone wasn't simply stealing money. They were moving it through the company while making the financial reports look healthy. I knew enough about corporate accounting to understand what that meant. If the numbers were wrong by that much, Westbridge wasn't just facing embarrassment. It could be facing lawsuits, regulatory investigations, and potentially bankruptcy. I spent the night reviewing everything I legally had access to. By 2:13 a.m., I found something that made me sit straight up. There was a recurring payment scheduled for Friday. $2.8 million. The recipient, Michael Coleman's company. I checked the date. It was 2 days away. I suddenly understood the caller's warning. Whatever was happening wasn't finished. It was accelerating. The next morning, I received an email from an unfamiliar attorney. His name was Daniel Brooks. The message was short. Ms. Carter, I represent a party with information concerning Westbridge Solutions. I believe you and I may have a mutual interest in speaking. I nearly deleted it. Then I noticed the attachment. It was a photograph of the same document I had been studying. Except Daniel had highlighted something I had missed. A signature. Richard's signature. My hands went cold. I called the number in the email. Daniel answered immediately. Emily. Yes. Who are you really representing? I can't discuss that over the phone. Then why contact me? Because you're about to become the easiest person for Richard to blame. I said nothing. Daniel continued. Westbridge is preparing to announce a major acquisition. If that deal closes, the financial irregularities disappear inside a much larger transaction. My stomach tightened. What acquisition? That's the problem. He paused. The acquisition doesn't actually exist. I stared at my laptop. So the company is being sold? Not exactly. Richard is planning to use the acquisition announcement to convince investors that Westbridge is financially stronger than it really is. I felt sick. Why are you telling me this? Because I have a client who invested heavily in Westbridge based on those numbers. That explained the urgency. Daniel wasn't calling because he cared about me. He wanted evidence. And I had it. But before I could respond, another call came through. Richard Coleman. I almost laughed. 2 days earlier, he had fired me in front of everyone. Now he was calling me. I answered. Emily. His voice sounded different. Not confident. Tired. What do you want? We need to talk. No, we don't. Please. That word stopped me. Richard Coleman had never said please to me. About what? There was a mistake. I almost couldn't believe what I was hearing. A mistake. We terminated you too quickly. You accused me of misconduct. I know. You humiliated me in front of my team. I know. You destroyed my professional reputation. I said I know. His voice cracked slightly. Then he said something I never expected. I need your help. I leaned back in my chair. Why? There was a long silence. Because our financial system is failing. I closed my eyes. Of course. The problem wasn't just the $480,000. The entire structure was collapsing. What happened? I asked. Several clients froze their accounts after an internal discrepancy was discovered. Who discovered it? We don't know. I almost smiled. I think you do. Richard went silent. Then he said, "Come back to the office." No. Emily, I'm asking you as a professional. You stopped treating me like a professional 2 days ago. He lowered his voice. Without you, I can't fix this. There it was. The sentence I never thought I would hear. The man who had called me a liability now needed me to save his company. But I wasn't going back without protection. I'll help, I said. Richard exhaled. Thank God. But there are conditions. His breathing stopped. You don't control this conversation anymore. What do you mean? I want written authority to review every financial record connected to the irregular payments. I want an independent auditor involved. And I want my termination officially documented as unrelated to the investigation. Richard didn't answer. Emily. Those are my terms. We don't have time. Then you should have thought about that before you fired me. Another silence. Finally, he said, Fine. But something in his voice bothered me. It sounded too easy. I agreed to meet him that afternoon. Before leaving, I called Daniel. I need legal protection. You have it. Why? Because I already filed something. What? Daniel hesitated. A preservation request. It prevents certain company records from being destroyed while the dispute is investigated. I froze. You filed that without telling me? I did it because I suspected Richard would try to erase evidence. I immediately opened my laptop. A few seconds later, I received a notification. Westbridge Solutions. Internal system alert. A large number of financial records had been accessed overnight. Someone was deleting files. I called Daniel back. They're destroying evidence. Then don't go to the office alone. I grabbed my coat. When I arrived at Westbridge, the lobby looked completely different. Employees were whispering. Phones were ringing. Managers were rushing between offices. And Richard was standing near the elevators. He looked exhausted. When he saw me, he walked toward me. Emily. I stopped. Where's David? Richard's face changed. He's not here. Where is he? I don't know. That was when Tom Reynolds hurried toward us. He looked pale. Emily, you need to see this. He handed me a printed document. I scanned the first page. Then the second. My heart started pounding. It wasn't an accounting report. It was a termination authorization. My termination authorization. Except the document contained something I had never seen before. A handwritten note at the bottom. Remove Emily before Friday. She knows about the second transfer. I looked at Richard. His face had gone completely white. You wrote this? No. Then who did? Richard didn't answer. Tom looked toward the hallway. Then he whispered. David. I looked at Richard again. For the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. And then his phone rang. He answered. His expression changed instantly. Hello. He listened. His face drained of color. What do you mean the money is gone? I stared at him. What money? Richard slowly lowered the phone. Then he looked directly at me. The $2.8 million. It disappeared. I felt the room tilt beneath me, because I suddenly understood. Someone wasn't stealing from Richard. Someone was setting him up. And the person who had fired me might not be the person pulling the strings. For 3 seconds, nobody spoke. Richard stood in the middle of the hallway with his phone still in his hand. The money is gone, he repeated. I looked at Tom. Then at the document he had given me. Remove Emily before Friday. She knows about the second transfer. Everything suddenly made sense, and somehow nothing did. I turned to Richard. Where was the $2.8 million supposed to go? He hesitated. That isn't important. It is now. His jaw tightened. Emily, we have bigger problems. No. We have the same problem. I pointed at the document. Someone wanted me gone before that transfer happened. Someone knew I had found the first payment, and now the second payment has disappeared. Richard stared at me. For once, he didn't have an answer. I looked at Tom. Take me to the finance department. We walked quickly through the office. Employees watched us pass. 2 days earlier, I had walked through the same building carrying a cardboard box. Now everyone was looking at me like I was the only person who knew what was happening. Maybe I was. Inside the finance department, I opened the company's transaction system. Several files were missing, but whoever had deleted them had made one mistake. They hadn't deleted the automated backup logs. I pulled up the transfer history. The $2.8 million hadn't disappeared. It had been transferred, just not where Richard thought. I followed the transaction through 3 intermediary accounts. Then I saw the final destination, a private investment account. The account holder was David Mercer. I stared at the screen. Tom whispered, "That's impossible." "No," I said quietly. "It's exactly what he wanted us to believe." Richard walked in behind us. "What did you find?" I turned the monitor toward him. His face went pale. "David." I nodded. "Your CFO moved the money." Richard sank into a chair. "But why?" I looked at him. "Because he needed someone else to take the blame." Richard shook his head. "He's been with me for 15 years. And you trusted him." Richard looked down. Then I noticed something else. A second transaction. The money hadn't stayed in David's account. It had been transferred again, this time to an investment fund. I called Daniel. "Daniel, I found the money." "Where?" "David Mercer moved it through an investment account." There was silence. Then Daniel said something unexpected. "Emily, don't touch the account." "Why?" "Because that account isn't the final destination." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "Send me the transaction details." I did. 5 minutes later, Daniel called back. "There's another entity behind it." "What entity?" "A holding company." "Who owns it?" Daniel paused. Then he said, "Richard Coleman." I looked at Richard. He was standing across from me. I slowly lowered the phone. Richard saw my expression. "What?" I didn't answer. Daniel had just told me that the money eventually ended up in a company controlled by Richard. The room became silent. Richard stared at me. "Emily, whatever you're thinking. You told me you didn't know where the money went." "I didn't. But it ended up in your company." "I didn't authorize that." I believed him. And that was the strangest part, because the evidence looked terrible. But something still didn't fit. Then I remembered the handwritten note. "She knows about the second transfer." Not "she knows about the money." The second transfer. That meant whoever wrote it knew exactly what was happening. I asked Richard one question. "Who had access to your signature?" He didn't answer immediately. Then his eyes widened. "David." "And who handled the corporate registration documents?" "David." I looked at Tom. "Call building security." Richard frowned. "Why?" "Because David may still be here." 10 minutes later, security found him in the underground parking garage. He wasn't running. He was sitting inside his car, waiting. When security brought him upstairs, David looked surprisingly calm. He looked at me and smiled. "You always were too curious, Emily." Richard stared at him. "Did you steal the money?" David laughed softly. "You still think this is about money?" Nobody spoke. David looked at Richard. "You were supposed to let me finish the acquisition." Richard's face changed. "What acquisition?" "The company was going to collapse. I had a buyer ready." Richard stared at him. "You were selling Westbridge?" "I was saving myself." Then he looked at me. "And you nearly ruined everything." I understood. David had been creating fake invoices, moving money, and manipulating financial reports. But there was another layer. He had been preparing to make Westbridge appear insolvent. Then he planned to acquire its valuable client contracts through another company. Richard wasn't innocent. He had ignored warning signs because he trusted David. But David had been running the scheme far longer than either of us realized. I looked at Richard. "Did you know about the first transfer?" He hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. "You knew," I said. Richard finally nodded. "I knew money was being moved. I thought David was using it to cover a temporary cash problem." "And you let him?" "I was afraid the company would collapse." "So you fired me instead?" His eyes dropped. "Yes." The room went quiet. That was the truth I had been waiting for. Richard hadn't personally planned everything, but he had protected David. And when he needed someone to blame, he chose me. Daniel arrived shortly afterward with investigators and independent auditors. The evidence was overwhelming. Emails, transaction records, backup logs, forged approvals, everything. David's scheme unraveled within days. Richard resigned as CEO before the investigation was completed. The board removed him from the company entirely. But I didn't return to Westbridge as an employee. I had learned something during those 48 hours. Sometimes winning doesn't mean getting your old life back. Sometimes winning means building a new one. 3 months later, I opened my own consulting firm. I called it Carter Operations Advisory. My first major client? A company that had previously done business with Westbridge. They had watched everything happen, and they wanted someone they could trust. Tom joined me 6 months later. Daniel became our legal advisor. And Westbridge? It survived, but it was never the same. The company rebuilt itself under new leadership. As for Richard, I saw him one final time at a business conference almost a year later. He approached me quietly. "You look successful." "I am." He smiled sadly. "I should have listened to you." I looked at him. "You should have trusted me." He nodded. "I know." There was a long silence. Then he asked, "Do you ever regret helping save the company?" I thought about the conference room, the envelope, the people watching, the cardboard box in my arms. Then I shook my head. "No." He looked surprised. "Why?" "Because I didn't save your company." I paused. "I saved myself." Richard looked away, and I walked past him. For years, I had believed my value came from the title on my office door, the salary on my paycheck, or the approval of someone above me. I was wrong. The day Richard fired me, I thought he had taken my future away. He hadn't. He had accidentally given me the courage to build one without him. And that became the greatest revenge of all. He fired me because he thought I was replaceable. I walked away and discovered I was never meant to work beneath him. I was meant to become impossible to overlook.